I'd first like to express my gratitude to the colleagues at UCLA, to friends and archivists, activists, tribal historians, elders, and others who've enabled this visit and my work to be possible. I'm deeply grateful to the many people who have close personal ties to the individuals and groups whose histories appear, often fragmented, in my work. Their lived knowledge and interpretations have strongly guided my understanding of this history. Scholar Sianina Lomawema, Muscogee Creek Nation, describes these kinds of insights and historical sources as the gifts. She reminds us that, and I'm quoting, "Gifts employ generosity. Generosity inspires respect, attention, analysis, responsibility, and affection for the giver." I hope that this presentation reflects these same values. It's been a particular honor to know and learn with Faith O'Neill, who is here today. And this talk will center especially on the life story of her grandmother, Elizabeth Faribault, a Dakota Nation member incarcerated at Canton Asylum from 1915 until 1928. Thank you, Faith. It's important to identify my own location in this work. I identify as a disabled, cisgender, white, anti-racist ally, a scholar activist. My hope today is to foster accessibility, inclusion, and integration. So please, stand up, move around, stretch, knit, do what you need to do in order to take care of yourself, including leave the room if and when you need to. I want to start now by noting an important lesson novelist Chimamanda Adichie teaches us. The danger of a single story, Adichie notes, is that it deprives individuals and groups of their inherent dignity. It flattens lived experiences, obscuring the often messy, diverse, and profoundly human qualities that inform our lives. I mention Adichie's instructive insight because it applies directly to our studies, our learning, our work, and our everyday lives. This work also begins with a simple assumption. Everyone has to be somewhere. I'm going to repeat that. Everyone has to be somewhere. But contests abound over where some people belong. Inextricably linked are considerations of with whom and to whom people belong. And we must also attend to why, as well as who decides this. So what follows is a dislocated history, by which I mean a history put out of usual or proper place, position, or relationship, a disrupted history. My research draws on a wide array of stories and storytellers, including common historical sources, text and photographic materials about and by people institutionalized at the Indian Asylum in Canton, South Dakota. Most of these sources are currently housed, unredacted, meaning uncensored, at National Archives repositories and at the South Dakota State Archives. The sheer amount of preserved material and the conspicuous absence of privacy measures applied to them present a unique and deeply complicated challenge. I'll return to this point later. Interviews and relationships with relatives of people held at the Canton Asylum, as well as with tribal leaders and activists, are vital authoritative sources as well. In particular, they vividly revealed the asylum's long reach and the continued struggles over diagnoses that impact Native communities to this day. This expands the narrow institutional story typically told by asylum staff and administrators at the time, and by many scholars, medical professionals, and others since. As just one very human example of this, I'd like to tell you a little bit about Elizabeth Alexis Faribault from the Dakota Nation, a member of the Great Sioux Nation. Elizabeth Faribault was born in 1882. Her family had lived for generations in what we today call Minnesota. Like many Dakota and other Native peoples, they were forced westward by the United States. Family members eventually settled in parts of North and South Dakota. This is where Elizabeth Alexis later met and, around 1900, married Jesse Faribault. The couple lived on the Sisseton Reservation, surrounded by their kin. Accounts vary as to how and why, in 1915, Elizabeth Faribault was institutionalized in the Canton Asylum, the only U.S. federal psychiatric institution created for American Indians. Non-Native observers at the time had described the Faribault household in positive terms. The couple had a sizable abode and good land for wheat harvest and a truck garden. Elizabeth tended the house and her two youngest children, Anne and Howard. Jesse farmed the land with Solomon, their eldest son. According to a Bureau of Indian Affairs, BIA, clerk at Sisseton, however, Elizabeth Faribault was, quote, violently insane, unquote, and caused, quote, great anxiety, close quote. Apparently offended by a verbal clash with Faribault on May 8, 1915, the clerk telegrammed Washington, D.C. headquarters requesting that she be removed to the Canton Asylum. On Saturday, May 29, a police officer and agency doctor arrived at the Faribault home and forcibly took the 32-year-old woman to the insane asylum. Her two young children were later found alone at the house by Jesse. From Sisseton, Elizabeth Faribault almost certainly was taken by the Chicago, St. Paul, and Milwaukee train nearly 200 miles south to Canton, where she would cross a threshold that marked a decidedly different national context. Tall wire fencing circled the federal asylum grounds. In the distance, the main building and newly constructed two-story hospital expressed U.S. ideals of order and power through their expansive brick and concrete structures. White staff would have met her and her escort as they entered the main hall, eyes traveling up and down the new arrival. Few records shed light on the admissions procedures at Canton, but likely Dr. H.R. Hummer, the asylum superintendent and sole physician, would have conducted a brief physical and psychological examination of Faribault. It appears that no documentation from Sisseton accompanied her. Sources about what followed remains uneven and fragmented. Later, Canton medical records report that Faribault was diagnosed with, quote, intoxication psychosis, unquote. Elizabeth Faribault would spend the next 13 years in the Canton Asylum. She would be one of nearly 400 men, women, and children from more than 50 indigenous nations forcibly held there during its 32-year existence, from 1902 to 1934. Elizabeth Faribault was not the only Sisseton member Canton Asylum held in its locked wards. One young Sisseton man had already spent 10 years there before Elizabeth Faribault arrived. Several more from her reservation would be dislocated there over the next decade. They were, by Dakota culture and custom, related. Now, when I speak of indigenous kin and indigenous extended family, I'm drawing on the ways that indigenous and Native American studies scholars, as well as Dakota elders, have used these terms. I intend them as a way to honor Native perspectives on relationships and roles between and among people, and also between and among other forms of existence. Mutual support, generosity, and sharing, a belief and practice of interdependence, are defining qualities of many indigenous nations, and these stem directly from kinship. Affinity, relationship, and collective experience drive the meaning of kin and extended family, as I'm using it here. Like the majority of Canton's incarcerated members, Elizabeth Faribault would die at Canton. Unlike most, this Dakota woman was not killed by tuberculosis, which claimed nearly half of Canton's forced occupants. In the late morning of March 2, 1928, Elizabeth Faribault was found dead on the floor of her ward. The 46-year-old had shown no previous signs of illness, and witnesses testified that she had risen early that morning and gotten dressed. In his report, Superintendent Hummer confirmed Faribault's apparent healthfulness. Quote, accordingly, he concluded, the cause of death is noted as heart failure, unquote. It's an assessment that Faith O'Neill and others find, at best, suspect. We continue to wonder how Elizabeth Faribault died. Where she is buried continues to haunt her family. To date, no documents confirm that her body arrived at the Sisseton Reservation. No location details remain for her presumed burial, nor how she was laid to rest. Of Faribault's Sisseton extended family at Canton, one girl, institutionalized and labeled a, quote, epileptic, a, quote, incurable condition when she was 11 in 1916, also died at Canton. Another woman similarly diagnosed, in addition to, quote, nymphomaniac and, quote, pathological liar, was committed in 1917. She was released 2 years later. Apparently, no documented diagnosis accompanied one Sisseton Dakota man who spent 5 years institutionalized before he was deemed, quote, practically recovered, close quote, by white doctors and discharged to Sisseton. That occurred when the asylum was forcibly closed amid scandal in 1933. Also at that time, another Dakota relative who'd been committed in 1905 when he was 19 years old and diagnosed with, quote, dementia praecox, the precursor to what's called schizophrenia today, and, quote, congenital imbecility. He was transferred first to St. Elizabeth's Hospital, the other federal psychiatric institution in Washington, D.C. He would be dislocated at least 2 more times, to the Public Service Hospital in Fort Worth, Texas, and then to the Public Service Hospital in Lexington, Kentucky. These were early forms of prison hospitals for, quote, addiction treatment, close quote. It's not clear when or where he died. I recognize that I've just shared a profound amount of hard information about people. I welcome the opportunity to take a moment to just sit with that before we continue. Thank you. The story of what happened to Elizabeth Faribault and to her kin in 1915 and the many years before and after it reveals the central importance of sovereignty, the messy entanglement of colonial settlerism, racism, ableism, and patriarchy, among other forces and systems of power and privilege. Why am I talking about sovereignty, you might ask? In U.S. history, sovereignty is generally presumed. It's self-evident. The U.S. is a sovereign nation. That's the single or dominant story. But the same is typically not true in U.S. accounts of Native American, North American history. Active efforts across U.S. history to disregard and dismantle Native nation sovereignty is central to this story. Recognizing Native sovereignty immediately impacts this storytelling. It acknowledges, for example, the numerous indigenous medical systems in what today is called geographically the United States. It means institutional terms such as Indian asylum and Canton asylum are those expressed by the incarcerated people around whom this work has grown. So I'm going to intentionally use terms also like people, incarcerated people, or forced inhabitant rather than administrators' labels such as patient, to draw attention to issues of power and humanity. And it means people's actual names appear only if and how their relatives have granted me permission to do so. As an example, Faith O'Neill and I have spoken at length about this, and she has granted me permission to use the actual names of her grandmother, Elizabeth Faribault, and her mother, Cora Winona Faribault. Another important concept of this story is ableism, as a system of power and privilege that discriminates against people who are or are perceived as being disabled, and that privileges those who are or are perceived as non-disabled. This includes pervading ideas, institutions, and social relations. As I hope to illustrate, ableism is an active force in this history, not so much disability nor madness, and white U.S. medical diagnosis is one of its mechanisms. I want to unpack this a little bit. In critical disability studies, we seek to complicate a powerful single story in U.S. history, what we commonly refer to as the Western biomedical model of disability, or medical model of disability. The medical model looks something like this. Gaining momentum in the 19th century, U.S. biomedicine came to define normalcy, health, and disability in increasingly bounded ways, as quantifiable and qualifiable, essentially static and knowable. Those with power to interpret this came primarily from medical backgrounds. So a problem arose when a person did not conform to these norms, and that problem resided in the individual. And thus the response to this dissonance has been to fix, cure, or treat the problem individual. This interpretation or story has extended far beyond medical settings, so that today, in many contexts, it seems natural, normal, and at times invisible. But by critically engaging with ableism, it becomes clear that this is not just one story or tradition. It's not universal, nor is it ahistorical. Rather, like all medical systems, it is context-specific and dynamic, revealing relationships between people, places, and systems of power. So what I'm hoping to do in my remaining time is to explore the overlaps between American Indian studies and disability studies, calling attention to the profound entanglement of racism, settler colonialism, and ableism. That's why I'm intentionally using the label white U.S. medical model to reflect an active process as well as a distinct and relational expression. This label recognizes that the United States emerges out of longer histories of conquest and empire, as does whiteness. It explicitly acknowledges that this medical form has longer historical roots, too. Focusing primarily on one of Canton's incarcerated members, Elizabeth Faribault, and her family, I hope intentionally counters, to some degree, the dehumanizing effects of institutionalization and institutional histories. Now, I'm not suggesting that Elizabeth Faribault's life was representative of all incarcerated people at Canton or elsewhere, but I believe her story vividly demonstrates how white U.S. medical diagnoses impact relationships beyond those pathologically labeled, marking kin and communities both inside and outside of Canton Asylum and across generations. These diagnoses in turn shape history and our lives today, from what, how, and which primary sources have been preserved, indexed, cataloged, disseminated, and interpreted, to whose stories get remembered and by whom. In U.S. disability studies and other areas, we often emphasize individual perspectives, reflecting U.S. cultural values, even as we seek to challenge ableism and the negative impact of the white U.S. medical model. But this deeply valuable approach also obscures other lived experiences and possibilities for understanding Indigenous extended family roles, systems, experiences, and resources for resistance, transformation, and survival. Paying close attention to Indigenous relationships fundamentally shifts our understanding of lived experience within the Canton Asylum. For example, brief, seemingly isolated observations by asylum staff and visitors cumulatively suggest expressions of survival and resistance. Anecdotes of Native women sitting together in circles, possibly singing, appear across the 3 decades Canton was open. Incarcerated people created dolls, belts, and beadwork, most of which were sold by the institution, although some were clearly given as gifts to other members at Canton. Affinity, relationship, and collective experience are present in all of these moments, even if historians are unable to fully access them. Even in fragmented form, a recentered story of Indigenous lived experiences laid bare the reality that ableism interrupts, disrupts, invalidates, and pathologizes kinship, well-being, and kinship as well-being. One way it does this is through diagnosis. Like many colleagues in critical disability studies and history, I'm drawn to a social and cultural critique of concepts and lived experiences commonly and presently called disability. This interpretation teaches us how disability is a relational experience, a relational concept, and part of a relational analytical frame. I contend that relationships similarly define and inform diagnoses. So I want to go back to the original story of Elizabeth Faribault and her dislocation in 1915, and all of the other lived stories touched by this institution. This story, of course, exists within a much broader context of settler colonialism and their associated campaigns of Native genocide and ethnocide. Across the late 19th and early 20th centuries, U.S.-designed institutions increasingly played a vital role in this conflict. Individually and collectively, reservations and allotment policies, church missions, prisons, and boarding schools, for example, contributed to the larger efforts by the U.S. to suppress Native communities and their distinct identities. In this context, people's incarceration at Canton is also a history of contested sovereignty in the locked wards of the past. The concept of disability itself changes in this light. Well-being comes closer to approximating the experience and concept reflected in Dakota Nation and many of the Native nations whose members were institutionalized at Canton. Now, I want to recognize that there are numerous forms of medicine that each Indigenous nation has, and well-being in overly general and simple forms has roots in the pre-conquest past. Harmony within and across supernatural and spirit realms plays an important role in these conceptions of well-being. Balance frames and guides it, balance in mind, body, and in the broader environment. So relationships between and across community members, including relationships with ancestors, matter significantly here. The many stories emanating from the Indian asylum emphasized well-being, which directly challenged the white U.S. medical terms and U.S. domination. Extant letters between kin, in addition to U.S. institutional documents from the asylum administrator and BIA, depict cultural political battles over authority and where incarcerated people actually belonged. Typically, spouses, parents, siblings, and adult children of incarcerated people petitioned the BIA and Canton's administrator, insisting that they knew their kin best and that they were well or well enough to be returned home. In most of these instances, kin made direct connections between their incarcerated loved ones' well-being and their families. Ending pathologized dislocation, returning members to their rightful place, physically among their people, and physically and metaphysically to an indigenous world, was essential for wellness. This native concept of wellness drew inextricable links between individual incarcerated members, their kin community, and the broader natural and supernatural worlds. As an example, between 1915 and 1920, Jesse Faribault visited his spouse, hired a lawyer to help obtain her release, and regularly petitioned the institution and the BIA. He specifically contested the white U.S. medical diagnosis of his wife. According to Jesse, Elizabeth had been, quote, under the influence of alcohol and was only drunk when she had crossed paths with the BIA clerk. He insisted that no legitimate proceedings had established her insanity and documented the hardship placed on the family after Elizabeth was taken away from them. Mary Alexis, Elizabeth's mother, also strained for years to gain her daughter's release, regularly collaborating with neighbors and extended family members. Advocates argued that she was, quote, perfectly sane, drawing attention to well-being. Elizabeth needed to return home, they claimed, for her well-being and for her family's. For them, Elizabeth's institutionalization brought harm, not treatment or comfort. Elizabeth Faribault and others also self-advocated through writing, regularly entreating H.R. Hummer and the BIA commissioner. They also insisted that they were well and needed to go home. They belonged at home. And like many others, Elizabeth Faribault also attempted to escape. Twice she broke free out of the institution. Twice she was captured and returned. They consistently demonstrated that they would never forget their indigenous homes or their kin who waited for them there. As described by BIA representatives, many Native people at Canton were relatives, and their familial connections contributed at least in part to their institutionalization. Sometimes they were removed to Canton at the same time, sometimes within 1 or 2 years of a relative's initial incarceration. The BIA similarly deployed eugenic white U.S. medical rationales to extend the incarceration of one or more members. They invoked kin relations on the outside to keep certain people on the inside. These recognized relationships are noted frequently in medical files and become part of what I call a pathological narrative. For example, in the face of sustained letter-writing campaigns on Elizabeth's behalf, Superintendent Hummer in 1918 raised eugenic concerns with the BIA that Jesse was defective, and therefore Elizabeth needed to be kept at Canton so that they would not produce more children and thus harm their family, community, and broader society. There are numerous examples of this, far beyond Elizabeth Faribault's. Considering the context of various Indigenous communities represented at Canton, the reality of kin relations becomes much more vast, profound, and immediate. It's just one illustration. More than 1/4, at least 105 people, were members of the Great Sioux Nation. More often than not, multiple members of Indigenous nations concurrently inhabited the asylum wards. And this does not even account for adoptive kin, relationships of sacred importance in many Indigenous nations. I note this as a way of drawing attention to Native extended family and community that's rendered invisible or non-existent in U.S. documents and institutional reports about Canton, but that directly impacted how individuals on the outside and inside of the asylum experienced the many dislocations of relatives. Now, while each of their stories varied, many, if not all, of the Native men, women, and children could have known at least one other person as kin, or recognized familial connections among them. This was certainly true for Elizabeth Faribault, although it does not mean that every incarcerated person could or did adhere to their nation's cultural norms for expressing or understanding kinship. Still, I think it matters that such specific Indigenous connections were present at Canton, even as they were ignored or misunderstood by non-Native staff and the BIA. Other stories of kin remain shadowed as well. Births of children on the inside present a particularly troubling understory at the Indian asylum. According to their advocates, psychiatric asylums were expected to provide, quote, care and treatment for inhabitants. Sex-segregated wards and close surveillance were intentional policies, in part to prohibit, quote, inappropriate sexual relations. Childbirths directly challenged these non-Native expectations, threatening the status of institutions, including Canton and the BIA, and their non-Native representatives. Official asylum correspondence and population rosters suggest that at least 7 incarcerated women became pregnant while institutionalized. These actual numbers and births of live children remain unknown. For many reasons, such details rarely appear in existing sources. But it's important to note that these breaches of eugenic principles and non-Native expectations of the asylum ultimately did not undermine Superintendent Hummer's authority. In fact, his framing of these situations, and it's important to note that he did the framing, amplified the pathological qualities of the institutionalized mothers. One of these mothers was Elizabeth Faribault. On September 28, 1926, Elizabeth Faribault gave birth to a daughter whom she named Cora Winona. In BIA reports, Dr. Hummer faulted Faribault for the birth, claiming that she had been given, quote, parole privileges, and that she had abused those repeatedly. Escaping twice, quote, giving birth to a child, constituted the 3rd violation of her privileges. The superintendent assured the BIA that he had investigated the situation, concluding that an incarcerated Dana man, Navajo, was the father. The couple's initial denial of the relationship, Hummer noted, further underscored their moral and mental failings. Consequently, he concluded, it was best for Elizabeth Faribault to remain under his, Hummer's, care at Canton. The BIA concurred. Until her unexpected death in 1928, Elizabeth Faribault and her child were kept together at the Indian asylum. Afterwards, H.R. Hummer insisted that Cora Winona remain. It appears that for the next 2 years, another institutionalized Lakota woman mothered young Cora Winona. External pressure from the BIA eventually led to the child's removal to the Good Shepherd Mission Orphanage in Fort Defiance, Arizona, in 1930. As with many dislocated histories, precious few sources remain to shed light on Cora Winona's life after leaving Canton. According to family members, Cora Winona never spoke about her childhood. Personal struggles undermine her ability to parent, but her fierce love of her children was transparent to family members. Cora Winona Faribault O'Neill died in 1965. She was 39 years old. We have no direct testimony from Elizabeth Faribault or the other mothers who had children inside of Canton about these experiences. Their silence also haunts this chapter of the story. Of course, many other haunting issues abound. But a key consideration is that H.R. Hummer used white U.S. medical ideas about mental health and competency in his position as medical authority. This process directly and necessarily disempowered, and I'm going to use the next term intentionally, invalidated Elizabeth Faribault and others as legitimate sources of knowledge. This framing takes on added meaning when considering contests over Dakota and other indigenous nations' sovereignty. Hummer, with the force of the U.S. government behind him, invalidated Dakota-kin relations, collateral impact on kin back at Sisseton, or his role in Faribault's pregnancy while under his supervision. And I just want to take a moment to note, within a complex context of U.S. Native American relations and history, the impact of Faribault families' collective dislocation, from their kinship homes to the reservations, Elizabeth Faribault's forced dislocation from the Sisseton Reservation to the Canton Institution, and Cora Winona's removal from Canton to the Fort Defiance Orphanage. These removals and others, and the extended incarcerations they experienced, incurred profound losses for Elizabeth Faribault and for her family. Given the significant advocacy for Elizabeth Faribault's release, we must ask, why did she remain at the asylum for so many years? After all, other women and men were discharged who were diagnosed, according to the white U.S. medical framework, with similar or more serious, quote, problems. To the outside world, H.R. Hummer repeatedly countered requests to discharge Faribault by insisting that she was incompetent to take care of her children, her mother, or herself. On the inside of the institution, however, his actions belie these claims. By 1920, Hummer's elderly parents lived with him on the asylum grounds, and the superintendent had assigned Elizabeth the role of caregiver to them. In so doing, I believe he tacitly acknowledged, at least to a certain degree, her mental competency. Other factors trouble this story. Individual and groups of staff members lodged complaints against Hummer, beginning from his first year as superintendent in 1908 through most of his tenure. Accusations of harassment, inappropriate touching, verbal abuse, and extramarital affairs led to regular hospital inspections. None resulted in his dismissal. The isolation of the asylum, the limited means for Elizabeth and others to resist or to access help, and a pattern of abuses invite speculation about other motivations behind Elizabeth Alexis Faribault's sustained removal. Attention to racism, colonialism, and ableism clarifies that at the Indian Asylum in Canton, white U.S. medical diagnoses served many purposes, including authorizing and then invalidating challenges to the asylum's superintendent, the BIA, and the U.S. government, including erasing harms caused by institutionalization and asylum staff. For example, Superintendent Hummer regularly pathologized the frequency of Elizabeth Faribault's written petitions, noting in his reports to the BIA that she had, quote, on many occasions, close quote, written to them both, and that every time, quote, the results has always been to keep her here. Hummer inferred that the repeated efforts by Faribault, as well as her allies and relatives, lacked credibility and perhaps even reflected inherent deviance. His interpretations are poignantly medical in their assessment and power, projecting seemingly objective clinical clarity, obscuring both individual biases and national expectations. I want to spotlight one particular letter of Faribault's. It's from January 1922 to David Mazzacute, the adult son of a prominent Dakota leader. It appears that this letter never reached its intended recipient, but remained in Dr. Hummer's files for many months. He later sent it instead to the BIA commissioner as, quote, an index of her, Elizabeth's, mentality. Hummer discounted it as an insane woman's incoherent rant, proof that she should remain institutionalized. Trying to comprehend this letter from her vantage point reveals a starkly different story. Embedded in the non-standard English, Faribault inserted Dakota. Tribal elders and a Dakota language professor helped me translate her missive, and I thank them profoundly for this assistance. The translation revealed a poignant description of Faribault's struggles, her sense of loss and fear that she was forgotten, with references to barriers, departures, losses, and hopes that all will be well. She entreated him to assist her. Affirming, perhaps asserting her existence within her broader Dakota community, she emphatically reiterated and closed her note with the phrase, "Hamaia, it is me, it is me." Now, it should come as no surprise that Superintendent cast Elizabeth Faribault and other incarcerated Native people as mentally incompetent and disordered. This diagnostic process, performed and reperformed repeatedly, directly benefited him. His position as the sole physician at Canton and its chief administrator, his job and his status, rested in large part on the BIA's belief that he possessed medical expertise, that Canton policies were effective, and that the project of institutionalizing Native people was a worthy investment. Dominant U.S. framings and material contexts, of course, continued to shape the story. Most of the sources I've referenced today, and there are many thousands of them, are held in locked national archives, but available for viewing by any visitor who can physically access these sites. The indexing labels doubly mark U.S. Federal Medical Authority. They're cataloged under the record group for the BIA and then under Canton Asylum. These sources are now dislocated from their intended recipients, and the subjects are marked especially by a pathological label, insane patient or inmate. This in turn has influenced historical research and interpretation. Examples abound. Various scholars, drawing on these materials, have reinscribed the white U.S. medical labels onto Elizabeth Faribault and Canton's other institutionalized people. In the past decade, for example, some scholars have specifically examined Faribault's 1922 letter to Mazakute, accepting without question the asylum superintendent's original, quote, diagnosis of the letter, agreeing that its non-standard grammar and unfamiliar language, Dakota, was evidence of her unsound mind. One historian referred to parts of her written expression as, quote, gibberish. It's also true for depictions of Canton's other institutionalized people, interpretations that reinforce stigmatizing frameworks and the institution's single story. As the multitude of sources about nearly 400 men, women, and children incarcerated at Canton Asylum attest, labels matter. I'd like to pause for a moment to consider more fully some of the terms applied to Elizabeth Alexis Faribault. Dakota, wife, patient, daughter, chronically insane, neighbor, perfectly sane, incapable of looking after herself, grandmother. Dissonance swirls between these labels, reminding us that battles over sovereignty and the cost borne by kin exist at every moment of this story, that the terms imposed, claimed, lived, and contested reflect a dislocated past. Of course, this story doesn't end with Elizabeth Faribault and others who lived, and most of whom died at Canton, with those discharged to reservations, with the people dislocated to St. Elizabeth's Hospital or to other federal psychiatric facilities, with all of their kin across generations, or with us today. The reach of white U.S. medical authority, among other potent factors, continued and continue to shape history. What happened, how, and which knowledge is preserved and disseminated, how it is indexed, cataloged, and interpreted. Almost all scholarly studies and non-native media reports still refer to people forcibly held at Canton as patients. Frameworks of family, when noted at all, typically obscure lived realities of indigenous kin relations. Almost none address Native sovereignty issues or systems of medicine. And with rare exception, they invoke the white U.S. medical diagnoses present in medical files. And that long reach of white U.S. medical diagnoses continues to shape the tellings of life's histories, even within Native communities. Some of the descendants of Canton's incarcerated members have shared with me wrenching confusion about their relatives. Were they whatever the BIA said they were? Others flatly reject the white U.S. medical diagnoses, but live with the cross-generational trauma and wounds of this violent medical intervention. Through the course of learning into this story, I've also met people who, until recently, never knew they had kin forcibly held at Canton. Stigma, separation, and isolation, among other factors, contributed to the nearly full erasure of the person from their kinship homes and communities. And, following their ancestors' acts of survival and resistance, some of these men and women actively seek to honor their Canton relatives as an indigenous process of restoration, reclamation, and well-being. Since the 1980s, when Lakota journalist activist Harold Ironshield initiated a campaign to remember those held at the Indian Asylum, descendants have gathered annually to participate in honoring ceremonies. They come to Canton, South Dakota by trains, cars, and planes. Many come in small or large groups. Others arrive alone. Most, if not all, claim one another as kin. The land itself bears witness to these changes and continuities since the asylum was shut down in 1934. The train depot has since closed, and the fencing around the campus has been taken down. After that, the main buildings were razed. Since 1946, the property has been known as the Hiawatha Golf Course. You can't make this up. Between the fourth and fifth holes of this manicured space of white sport and leisure is the asylum cemetery, symbolically cordoned off with now crumbling split rail fencing. There are 120 known Native people buried in mostly unmarked graves in this cemetery. Most of the names inscribed on a historic marker reflect U.S. government references, English Christianized names, or English approximate translation of indigenous names. Some of the people who the honoring ceremonies attend have immediate kin laid to rest in this cemetery. Some have no idea where their incarcerated ancestors were buried. Struggle over memory abounds. Loss, grief, and wonderment ripples across generations. It fuels efforts to remember, to heal, and this in turn offers an important call to others interested in lived and living stories of the past. Counter stories from incarcerated people at the Indian Asylum and from their relatives across generations offer a vital and different understanding typically found in the dominant narratives, or as Chimamanda Adichie would call it, a dangerous single story. They directly challenge dominant U.S. institutional narratives that justified their dislocation. They insist that we reconsider the ways settler colonialism and a white U.S. medical system are linked together and around these histories, that sovereignty has been and remains central at every point. Remembering these stories calls us to consider more broadly and rigorously the relational and national cultural aspects of diagnoses, of authority, of well-being, of relationships, and of knowledge itself. Admittedly, this may invite a different disordering of the past, meaning the disrupting the neat arrangement of something. But history has never been lived in neat arrangements, and we, and I mean everybody here, deserve the opportunity to bear witness to and reckon with more widely membered and remembered stories. Now, I've been asked about how learning about these lived histories of people incarcerated at the Canton Asylum can inform day-to-day work for people today, including social workers, legal advocates, and others engaged with medicine and public health. I'd like to offer a few points that are not in any particular order or disorder. I want us to return to the concept of a danger of a single story, the way it collapses and erases broader experiences and legacies. For non-Native people and those outside of disability cultural communities, contending rigorously with Native sovereignty, with disability culture, and other lived realities may collide with our understandings of our work. It draws our attention to the profound impact of the white U.S. medical model. And here, I don't mean to cast white U.S. medical model as good or bad, but to note that it carries immense power, the immediate swarm of cultural meanings that attach to labels and from labels to people. Think about terms like incompetent, insane, the pervasive presence of stigmatized disability terms that are used to silence people, to dismiss their ideas, their realities, their communities, and their lives. It reminds us about where problems are actually located. In the medical model, that is in an individual, and thus a specific kind of response is offered to fix or cure the individual. That's a single story approach. I think that the story coming from Canton Asylum, as it was lived by these hundreds of people and their kin, calls us to consider many other stories and interpretations. It draws our attention to the harms and problems located in systems of power and privilege, of disabling environments, and disempowering and damaging attitudes that perpetuate inequality and undermine well-being. Which is to say, that part of the power of the white US medical model is that it affects more than just the person labeled with a diagnosis from the system. It impacts relationships to others at the time and across generations. And this, of course, has direct bearing on important fields in the United States, including, but not limited to, social work, law and policy, education, including higher education, history, anthropology, public health, and medicine, which have all been complicit in supporting settler colonialism, racism, ableism, and other systems of power and privilege, in discriminating against Native and other racialized minorities, against disabled, queer, and poor people, and people who inhabit multiple marginalized identities. Contending with these legacies and the continued practices that perpetuate this demands of us to keep asking who's here and who's not here in the content of our learning, our curriculum, including professional development programming, in our workplaces, where we live, play, and struggle. It complicates our understanding of private versus public information. The Canton Asylum materials are located in places where many people, but often not actual relatives, can access personal information. It also matters who's sharing information and with whom. Faith O'Neill and I, in many conversations, have talked about the profound impact of her learning about her grandmother and her mother through scholars' work that involved no consultation with her or her family, and the profound sadness and harm caused by reading about one's kin through a medical lens, through the lens of settler colonialism. It's a cautionary tale for those of us who seek to reduce inequality and harm in the world, to consider the ways that our use of information, even if it's in the public realm, to reconsider the accountability we may have to those for whom this is family story, or this is family history. It demands in a very rigorous way that we reconsider to whom are we accountable and who's recognized as an authority. It demands that we consider the ways that disabled people and people of color and those who inhabit these identities and more are experts in our lives. And it means thus that we have to consider the process, the extent to which any of us are engaged with helping, and the complexity of what helping may mean, versus collaborating with and supporting others. Where is power in our relationship when we work and learn with others? Who has that power and who doesn't? And in what ways are we perpetuating marginalization? This means, in very basic ways, we must seek out other stories and perspectives and critical feedback. What do the communities you serve want? How do they want it? And what might they want you to do and not to do in coalition toward these goals? For those of us committed to a more just, inclusive world, these are calls that we must answer. Thank you.